What if we are hardwired to fall victim to data illusions? Those spurious patterns, those misleading headlines, and those cognitive traps often result in costly human mistakes. It turns out we can avoid these mental traps once we understand the statistical principles underlying games, chance, and the role of luck in various aspects of life. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome back to A Seat at the Table. In each episode, we sit down with leaders, innovators, authors, and entrepreneurs so that we can learn best practices that will empower our businesses. Today, we're joined by Dr. Michael Orkin, a renowned statistician, data scientist, and consultant whose career has spanned advising casino odds makers, coaching Fortune 100 strategy teams, and debunking statistical myths in health, finance, and beyond. He currently serves on the mathematics faculty at Berkeley City College. In this episode of A Seat at the Table, Dr. Orkin will be discussing what the vaccine-autism myth teaches us about leaping from correlation to causation, how a tiny shift in sample size can turn a reliable poll into clickbait fodder, and how a self-styled Wall Street guru racked up a flawless crash prediction record and why that streak misleads. This is such an exciting topic, so let's dive in and learn about the statistics behind the headlines. Dr. Orkin, thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table. I am thrilled to have you with us on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Jane. It's a good show.
Thank you. I think that what you talk about is so important. I mean, you talk about how we're hardwired to fall victim to data illusions. There could be nothing more relevant to discuss in today's day and age than what you talk about. I think that the people listening to this, primarily people who are senior executives in 171 countries and territories around the world, but I think the commonality is that everybody is somehow struggling, right, to make sense of all the different data and different analysis that's being thrown at us and try to get to the bottom of it, right, to try to understand, well, what's actually true.
Right. It's a big problem, and well, it's an important issue. I mean, people have said a couple of years ago, someone from Google said that statistics is the most important course that anyone can take in college, and that's what I do. Well, one of the things I do is teach elementary statistics, along with doing a lot of consulting and authoring of books and stuff. But it's true.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it should be sort of mandatory learning for anybody in this day and age. And I'm really excited to dive in to this podcast with you, talking about, as you refer to, margin of error checks and various other criteria that people can use to make sense of the different data and things that are being thrown at us. Maybe to start off, you could talk a little bit about how a tiny shift in sample size can turn a reliable poll into clickbait fodder. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the important thing about there's sort of a list of a few important things when you're doing a sample and doing something like a public opinion poll or a quality assurance poll, or any one of a few polls that are done that are mathematically basically the same thing. And one of the things is that you have to have a large enough sample to be reliable, in the sense that, for example, if I just take a sample, this is an extreme, if I take a sample of one person and ask them what their opinion is on something, or if I take a sample of one item off the assembly line and see if it's broken or not, see if it works well or not, it doesn't tell me anything, because there's, in some sense, a 50-50 chance that you'll be right if you don't have any other information. And so you need to have a large enough sample size. But even then, there's something, you have to make a statistical calculation, and there's something called the margin of error, because when you estimate the result of something, you're never going to be, just because of random. So the big thing that people have to worry about is randomness and how to control this. And by randomness, I'm not talking about the physics version of randomness and quantum physics and stuff like that. I'm just talking about when you're uncertain about something. For instance, when you just take a random sample in which everybody has the same chance of being selected, there's still uncertainty, and you have to be able to measure that, or your results aren't going to be aren't going to be valid. And so the way to measure that is to not look at just your sample percentage who favor a certain thing, or sample percentage of items that are defective, or various other the sample of animals out in the woods who have rabies. Um, what you have to do is allow this margin of error, which is a plus or minus part. So it's a little interval or range around the sample that allows you to be confident of your result, like 95% confident. So when you look at polling results, you'll see the percentage who are in favor of something, but that's not enough. You'll see along with that in the write-up of the result, a margin of error, which is usually 3%. And that means that you go plus or minus 3% around your sample percentage to be 95% sure that your percentage is close to the real population percentage, which is unknown.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I'm really glad you brought that up because a lot of surveys that are put out, not all obviously, but a lot, are using a very small sample size
Mhm.
and they can get the exact results they want simply
Yeah.
by using a small sample size, as you're saying, but then claiming that that was the result of that sample. So they're not
Yeah.
100% lying, but it
Yeah.
lacks a lot of accuracy.
Well, the result of the sample, you're right, it's obviously supposed to represent the result in the population. If you just give the result and say, this is my sample result, it doesn't mean anything. But you don't need, well, it depends what you mean by a large or a small sample. But interestingly enough, if you look at the public opinion poll write-ups, you'll see the typical sample size is between 1,000 and 1,500. So that's a lot when you think about the amount of work that goes into taking a random sample, because uh, it's not easy to take a random sample. But when you think about taking a sample of 1,000 to 1,500 people from a population of 300 million people like the US, it sounds like awfully small sample, but it's really not. It turns out that a sample of size, let's say around 1,000, and a good random sample, maybe even a phone survey, is enough to get an accurate measurement of the opinion of people, let's say every adult in this country. So
Wow.
that's kind of startling. But
Yes.
there are some issues, though. I mean, one of the issues that you have to be careful of, and which was um, important in the last couple of elections, is the polls, not this last election, but the one before this last election, the polls were pretty accurate. But the one before it, the 2020 election, was notoriously bad, and that all the polling, even very respected polling organizations, were off. And so there are reasons for that, and it's not the fact that you have too small of a sample. One of the reasons is that people didn't want to divulge who they were voting for in that
Right.
election, and so it's very hard to get accurate information. Um, and some people didn't tell the truth. They didn't want to admit they were going to vote for Trump or going to
Right.
vote for Biden. And so that was a notorious. And also another thing is people, the polls taken a week before the election. You think, oh yeah, that's good. But people didn't make up their mind until 2 days before the election. And so changing your mind is another big problem for a public opinion poll. Now, when you're doing a quality assurance poll, which is the same kind of a poll, taking items off the assembly line, you don't run into those problems. So you can be rest assured that your statistical methods will be very good.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. There's so many more variables in order to
Yeah.
get accuracy that are so dependent upon what you're polling for, as you're pointing out here.
Yeah, people are harder to survey than pieces of equipment,
Yeah.
um, which are either broken or not for a quality assurance type of poll. Um,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned that a self-styled Wall Street guru, right, had racked up a flawless crash prediction record,
Right.
and why that streak misleads. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so that actually leads into some other things too, and that is these people who make predictions. There was a guy, and I mentioned this in my book, which I want to plug for a second,
Okay.
the story of chance beyond the margin of error, second edition, which you can get at Amazon. Um, anyway, there was a web, he's still on TV, a very well-known Wall Street person who's a stock prognosticator, and he gives advice on TV. And he's one of the things he's famous for is he's predicted every stock market crash for the last 30 years.
Wow.
And so and so you think, wow, that's really good. But what he does is every week he predicts a stock market crash.
Right.
So he has then he successfully predicts every crash because he's always predicting a crash. But he's wrong every time that there's not a crash. But people, just human nature, people don't pay attention to that. They only pay attention to predictions of something that's really unlikely. And so the same thing is true with lottery winners. The chance of winning the Mega Millions lottery is about 1 in 290 million. So there are two drawings a week, and every now and then there are winners. But most of the time there are losers. But you don't read stories in the newspaper about the losers. You only pay attention to the winners. And in fact, that brings up another point about lotteries, which is similar to buying a lottery ticket is like making a prediction if you're just guessing. If you have some inside information or something, then it becomes different. But if you're just guessing, buying a ticket to the lottery is just guessing that your ticket is going to be the winner. Now, some people have systems. Some people resort to astrology and numbers they saw in their oatmeal that morning. But it's all picking lottery numbers is random. And their lottery equipment for big multi-state lotteries like the Mega Millions lottery is the equipment is very highly maintained, and it's very unlikely that there'll be some flaw in the way the random numbers are selected. It's also very unlikely that there'll be cheaters in the Mega Millions lottery, a big lottery like that. Although I must admit that just last week there was a huge scandal about college football games being fixed, which is kind of scary to people who are interested in the betting markets and gambling on sports. But anyway, the chance, if you buy a ticket, the chance you'll win the Mega Millions lottery is 1 in 290 million, roughly. Now, that's a really low number. In fact, most people have trouble, even mathematicians, understanding how low that number is.
Right.
So here's some analogies or metaphors work to help understand that. If you buy 50 tickets a week, 50 Mega Million lottery tickets a week, you win the jackpot on the average of once every 112,000 years. If every time you drive a mile, you buy a lottery ticket, you'll have to drive an average of 608 an average mileage of 608 round trips to the moon before you win the jackpot. This is all I'm talking about averages. If you have one friend in Canada, one friend in the entire country of Canada, and there are about 40 million people in Canada, and if you put everyone's name in Canada in a box on little pieces of paper, close your eyes and draw one name from the 40 million names in Canada, and buy a lottery ticket, you're 7 times more likely to draw your friend's name than you are to win the jackpot.
Wow.
So that brings up an interesting question. And the question is, okay, and people ask me this question, okay, if you're telling me all these things, it's so unlikely, how come there are winners? Because you can say with those odds, nobody's going to win. And the answer is because so many tickets are sold. So if you sell enough tickets to a weird, unlikely event, I wouldn't say it's weird, actually, just an unlikely random event, somebody will win. And so the question isn't then, but your chance of winning is always the same. If you buy one ticket, 1 in 290 million. If you buy two tickets, it's 2 in 290 million, and so on. So the right question statistically to ask is not if you're looking at this type of thing, is not what's the chance that I'm going to win, but what's the chance that someone will win? And it turns out, if you get about 15, 20 million people buying tickets, the odds get to be such that there will be winners. And there are, and that's sort of what happens. But that explains, so that's an interesting thing by itself. But it also explains weird occurrences and events in everyday life. So, for example, you go into a coffee shop and you see your long lost cousin you haven't seen in 20 years, and you think, wow, what a coincidence. That's so weird. But it turns out, if you think about it, that there are people going into coffee shops all over the country, and there are also long lost cousins roaming around. And so with enough people and enough attempts, it's just like winning the lottery. If you have enough opportunity, there will be winners. And so that's true of weird events. The famous psychiatrist and author who from Switzerland, Jung, I hope I pronounce his name okay, it was very popular in the 20th century, but still he was writing books in the 20th century. Now in the 21st century, he's no longer around, but he had this term he called synchronicity.
Oh, yes.
Synchronicity, you may have heard of it. I mean, synchronicity is supposed to be this new force or factor that is somewhere in between randomness and causality, which we'll talk about in a minute, causality. And that explains all these weird coincidences. But it turns out that Jung wasn't thinking about it right because he didn't have the data to show, or just the math to show. You don't really need data to show this, but the math to show that you have enough opportunity for a weird thing to happen. It will happen just by chance. That's why there are lottery winners. It's not because of astrology. It's not because of any weird forces. It's just because of the nature of randomness.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
So interesting. You really, when you explain it, it definitely reframes things because it's very easy to fall prey to what looks like is happening, right?
Right.
And then when you break it down like that and show, the mathematical side of it, it's like, oh, yes, okay, that makes sense. But it's still easy. And that's, I guess, why all these headlines and different types of polls that lead you in one direction or another are so effective, right? While we keep buying lottery tickets and doing all kinds of things. Now, you talk about Paul the octopus's story, right? And his perfect World Cup streak. Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, Paul was really, there really is such a character as Paul the octopus. And he was in an aquarium in Germany a number of years ago, a few years ago. And I have a little write-up of Paul in a chapter on Paul in my book. And Paul was amazingly successful in picking the results of soccer matches, which are the main sport that people bet on in Europe. And he not just ordinary soccer matches, but World Cup matches, high-level soccer matches. And the way he would do it was his trainer would put some food in same type of food in two bowls. And in one bowl, he put the flag of the team that of one of the teams in a match, and on the other bowl he put the flag of the other team, or the logo. And Paul would pick one of the two bowls. The first bowl he picked would be Paul's pick for the winner of the match. And so over the course of a couple of years, he picked the winners of 12 out of 14 high level, like semifinal and final soccer matches, and got a ton of publicity. And the chance of doing that, if you're just guessing whether you're an octopus or a person, is 50-50 for each time, because they're just two. If you don't know what you're doing and you just guess, there are two teams in the game. So the chance of getting 12 out of 14 correct is about it's less than 1 in 100. It's about 6 in 1,000. So that's very unlikely. That would be called statistically significant. Very unlikely that Paul would do that. And so he got all kinds of press about how he was somehow octopi, or very intelligent creature, and how he was somehow figuring out who was going to win these matches just by looking at the flag of the team. Well, so you could ask the question, how could that be happening? And the answer is the same as the lottery answer. How could people be winning the lottery? And so the reason for that is, in this case, is that Paul wasn't the only animal picking soccer matches. There were lots of other animals, and they weren't doing so well. So I like to say luck is a group activity. For every winner, there are a whole bunch of unlucky losers. And in this case, the unlucky losers were other animals. You could even argue, and I don't even do that, but you could argue that everybody who was picking soccer matches should be included in the data, which would make Paul's results sort of mundane. But if you compare them, just look at the other animals, it's not that unlikely that someone would win. So I'll read a couple sentences from my chapter on Paul. Some other German oracles did not fare so well in the World Cup. The animals at the Chemnitz Zoo were wrong on all of Germany's group stage games, talking about soccer matches. With Leon the porcupine picking Australia, Petty the pygmy hippopotamus spurning Germany's apple-topped pile of hay instead of Serbia, and Anton the tamarin eating a raisin representing Ghana. Manny the parakeet of Singapore became famous for correctly predicting the results of all 4 quarter-final matches. Manny contradicted Paul by picking the Netherlands to win the final, resulting in some media outlets describing the game as an octopus versus parakeet showdown. And so animals picking, in this country, it's the same thing. They're just for promotional purposes. Various casinos in Las Vegas have animals that pick the results of football games from time to time. And so to see one animal do really well is remarkable, but it also seems crazy. But in a field of other animals, it's not so unlikely.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. So that's really was the secret to Paul the octopus's success.
Well, yeah. So it's like saying that's the secret to a lottery winner's success. It's because you can't consider one lottery winner as having some secret knowledge when it's all random. The thing is, if there are lots of people, lots of tickets sold, then that's exactly right. There will be a winner from time to time, and that winner is the lucky one out of a group in which the others are unlucky losers. And so Paul's success is not because of Paul, but because of all the animals who are participating.
But how did it continually come up with him out of that pool being right? I mean, how would you explain that? How would you calculate that?
Well, okay, here's another example. Suppose you have 1,000 people who each toss a coin 10 times. Okay. The chance of getting 10 heads out of 10 tosses is about 1 in 1,000. So if you frame it like whoever gets the most heads is the winner, you have 1,000 people doing it, so they're betting on it or something. then it's very unlikely that I will get 10 heads in a row, or you. Try it.
Right.
If you toss a
Right.
coin 10 times, not going to happen, or very unlikely. The chance is 1 in 1,024. But if you have 1,000 people doing it, you're going to probably have a winner,
Right.
someone who gets 10 heads in a row. So it's the
Right.
same thing. So the winner is just the lucky one.
Right.
So
If you expand the pool enough, in other words, is what you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah. So Paul the octopus was just the lucky one.
Yeah. Wow. Really incredible. And yet, even after you explain it, people will still be inclined, probably myself included, to see something like that and say, "Oh, let's see what he has to say."
Right. Yeah. So
Right?
and people are doing, yeah, people are doing, statisticians have written numerous papers about this, and there's some things that just seem really weird. But so, for example, there are some stores that sell more than their share of winning lottery tickets. So
Right.
assuming everything's on the level and there's no cheating, you'd say, how could this store in Cincinnati sell 5 winning lottery tickets in 2 years, whereas nobody else is selling anywhere near that? And so there are a couple statisticians who wrote a paper on that. And it's sort of, the math gets a little bit tricky, but you have to have good data showing ticket sales at lots of different stores. But it's not a function just of the store, but of how many people go there and buy tickets. And showed that it was basically just random, that store was the lucky store.
Right.
Not
Yeah.
to
And that
be
luck
not to
really is
be
just luck.
right, not to be confused with the grocery store chain called Lucky.
Right. Now let's touch upon what you have said about the Zener card experiments, which I think is very interesting because, as you said, it talks about people's hunger, right, for psychic certainty, and I think
Right.
that's such a big thing because you can see the popularity of horoscopes, and even people will say, "Oh, no, I know this isn't really true," but you still want to read it, right? You still can't help taking a peek. So perhaps you could touch upon that a bit.
Okay, so back in the 1960s or so, back in the heyday of the psychedelic movement, psychic powers were very popular, or just trying to find people with psychic powers. And on TV, there were just lots of people who did this. Now, um, magicians who had like memory experts and stuff who claimed that psychic power has been around for a long time, hundreds of years. But it got to be real popular in the mid 20th century. So one of the questions was, somebody claims to have psychic powers, how do you prove it? How do you show that the person has psychic powers? Well, this became such a popular thing that a couple of scientists at Duke University, the head was Dr. Rin, Rinne. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly. I think they were psychologists, but anyway, they set up a psychic testing lab at Duke
Right.
University. And they developed a test called the Zener card test, which is what you mentioned. And there are various versions of it, but the basic idea is you have you have two people, the researcher and the person who says that they have psychic powers, sitting at a table with an opaque barrier between them so they can't see each other. And the researcher holds up a card. Now, the simplest version is just, let's say, a square and a circle. And
Mm.
so the person claiming to have mind reading ability or whatever tries to guess the card that the researcher is holding up. And if they guess it right, they get a point. If they don't, it's wrong. And then they do it a whole bunch of times because there's always a 50-50 chance that they'll be right. If you hold up a card that I can't see, that's either a circle or a square, and I just guess, I have a 50-50 chance of being right. So you do it a bunch of times, and you statistically see if the result is what they call statistically significant, which is a term in statistics, which means, generally speaking, that the chance of this happening just by guessing is very low. Now,
Right.
the standard cutoff point for very low is usually 0.05. So if the
Okay.
result is less than 0.05 in probability, then you would say something else is going on. I mean, maybe the person's cheating, maybe they have psychic powers, whatever. You rule out chance. That's the standard statistical method. Well, that's great. But if you test 100 people or 500 people or 1,000 people, which is what they were doing at Duke University, something happens. It's the same thing as the lottery. Namely, there's opportunity for people to just get lucky. So out of every 100 people, if you use that 0.05 cutoff point, which is still statisticians these days have all kinds of methods of trying to make sure that the results are more than just statistically significant at the 0.05 level, but that's another story. But if you just say, okay, if the chance that you, which sort of means sort of like if you get 60 or better out of 100, something like that, then that's statistically significant. Okay, it's easy to do the computations. But the problem is 5 people out of 100 who are just guessing will have a statistically significant result. In other words, they're just lucky in having this result that looks like they're doing better than guessing. And so in the Zener card test, lots of people were found to have so-called psychic powers, but when they were retested, which is one of the ways that you can check these things, when they were retested, they did not get the same results. And a number of newspaper articles it still exists. It's not at Duke University anymore. This particular lab is now still near the Duke campus, I believe. I think it's in Durham, North Carolina, someplace like that. But there are other places like Berkeley, which is one of the hotbeds of psychic stuff back in the 60s when I was a student. There has something called the Berkeley Psychic Institute, where they do things like tests. So the Zener card test is still used, but there have been a number of newspaper articles written in which the New York Times had an article, which I think I mentioned in my book. I mentioned a couple of articles in which they test all these, they look at all these tests like the Zener card test, and it's the same thing as the lottery and these other situations that we were looking at, namely, given enough opportunity, people appear to have psychic powers, but they're really just guessing. Now, on the other hand, you can watch TV shows like Penn and Teller has a long-running show. It's been on for at least a dozen years, and they're a magic act in Las Vegas, but they have other magicians come on the show and try to fool Penn and Teller, in which case they get a nice reward.
Right.
And some of the magicians are mind readers, and they try to do tricks. So these are magic tricks that have these explanations. It's not like just guessing, but it's not having psychic powers either.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think that when you sort of pull the curtain back and explain it, it makes sense. But without that, it does seem so real. And you're right, people do have that desire to believe in these things. So then you're preconditioned, right? Because it's what you want as the outcome.
Right, that's right. And so, I mean, like there are astrologers who, and I'm not at all well versed, there's lots of astrology in which you're not making weird predictions. You're looking at various things related to someone's birth and other things and trying to understand. It's sort of like psychology in a way. But there are some astrology situations where it's the same thing. They try to predict what's going to happen in the future. And you have enough astrologers making predictions, you'll get some who are just lucky, who will claim to be able to predict the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just important that you brought it up, because if someone doesn't actually get that on the table and talk about it, it is really, really difficult, right? To pull yourself back from wanting to believe what you want to believe.
Yeah, and in fact, if you watch Penn and Teller, I mean, they have magicians on there who are amazingly good, and there are always explanations, but it's still really fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, shifting to just a little bit different angle on this. You talk about how the vaccine autism myth, what that teaches us about leaping from correlation to causation.
Right. And I think if I had to, if you asked me, which you're sort of asking me now, what's the main thing that people misunderstand in trying to make policy decisions like what's getting done now at Health and Human Services? It's mistaking correlation for causation, or looking at things that are correlated and trying to say, oh yeah, that means there's causation. People have been doing that since the Stone Age, because
Right.
your
Yeah.
life depends on, is that rustle in the weeds an animal that's about to attack me, or is it just the wind? And so that's, how do I decide? And so here's an example. So anyway, my opinion is that this is misused the most when looking at medical type things. So here's
Yeah.
an example. Back and we'll get to the vaccine, to the MMR vaccine in a minute. Back in the late 1950s, when the polio vaccine was being developed, there were two actually: the Salk vaccine and the Sabin vaccine. But anyway, now we've had for many, many years, since around 1960, polio vaccines that work. A researcher was doing some research and just trying to find, just searching through data snooping, call it, and found that there's a strong positive correlation between polio incidence and soft drink sales. And so the health food people jumped on this and went crazy and said, okay, that just proves what we've been saying. If you drink lots of Coca-Colas, bad things happen. And so it turns out it's true. There is a strong positive correlation between polio incidence and soft drink sales. That is, the higher soft drink sales are, the more polio incidence there is. That's true. Now, the question, though, isn't, is that true? The question is, why is it true?
Right.
And the answer is the weather.
Oh, really?
As the weather gets warmer, the polio virus gets more active and more people drink sodas.
Oh my gosh.
And so that explains the whole thing. It's got nothing to do with Coca-Cola or any soft drinks causing polio. That's not the case. There's this hidden, what's called a confounding variable that explains the whole thing. Sometimes it's not so simple, but that's sort of the basic reason that you have to. One of the things I stress to my students is that correlation does not mean causation.
Yes.
A similar study found that there's a positive. So let me back up for 1 second. So the polio thing, that's true. There is a correlation. It's just there's not causation.
Yes.
So another example is there's a positive correlation found between alcohol use and lung cancer.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And so, people say, oh yeah, well, alcohol's bad for you, and lung cancer doesn't surprise me. But it turns out that's not true. The reason that positive correlation is true, the correlation is true, the causation is not true. Drinking alcohol doesn't cause lung cancer. It might cause other kinds of cancer, but the reason that this correlation exists is, again, this confounding variable, which is smoking. People who drink alcohol are more likely to smoke than people who don't. So when you do a study and you don't account for that, it'll look like the people who drink alcohol are more likely to get lung cancer, when really it's just the smokers are more likely to get lung cancer.
Right.
And so that explains that one, the same idea. Now, the one that just in general, vaccines are front and center these days because of RFK Jr., who's the new head of Health and Human Services. So one of the for a while there, he was saying that vaccines cause autism. Well, the first study, one of the main studies that it showed this was a study by this physician named Wakefield in England, who was about maybe 40, 50 years, 30 or 40 years ago, had a sample of 8 people, or maybe it was somewhere under 15 people, kids, and a bunch of them, and they all took the vaccine, and a bunch of them had autism, were diagnosed with autism. So once again, this is not a controlled study. In fact,
Right.
you have to compare the same situation with people who don't get vaccinated and see if the autism is more with it's what's called a control group and experimental group. The control group gets a placebo. None of that was done in this study, and in fact, it turned out later that the study itself was a fraud. That this guy was taking people, kids, excuse me, who didn't have autism, taking them out of the study.
Oh,
And
really?
so the paper was later retracted, and all the co-authors left, and this guy at Wakefield was totally humiliated. But people were still using that result, like RFK Jr. I don't think he does nowadays. But in order to get around these problems, what you do is what's called a randomized controlled experiment. And that means you have 2 samples, or you start out with a bunch of people, and then you want to have an experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group gets the vaccine. In this case, we're talking about vaccines. The control group gets a placebo, which is, if it's a vaccine where you get a shot, it's just a shot with sugar water in it. And these 2 groups are randomized in the sense that you start out with a bunch of people and you randomly select who goes in each group. You don't just, the researcher doesn't get to decide who goes in which group, in each group. Not only that, it's a blind study, which means the researcher, which means that the participants don't know which group they're in. That's why it's called a placebo. And it's also a double-blind study, which means the researcher doesn't even know until the experiment's over. So when you do all those things, especially the random assignment, which might be the most important feature of this type of experiment, means that you control for all these background variables by randomly assigning people to each group. And you have a large enough sample so that the randomness part can be pretty well accounted for. So there have been a number of major studies. In fact, there was one, I think it was with Denmark, in which every single baby who gets who was born in that country for something like 2 years, there were like 800,000 kids in this study. And it was a controlled study, and some were vaccinated and some weren't, blah, blah, blah. And random assignment showed absolutely no relationship between the MMR, that's measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR vaccine, and autism. And there have been a number of similar studies. These studies are very expensive and they take years. And so now when you see these people saying, well, we want to look at it again. Well, how do you look at it? How do you look at it again? First of all, there's all this overwhelming evidence that vaccines don't cause autism. By the way, they sort of, this is sort of interesting. They backed off the vaccines cause autism claim, and now I think they're talking about Tylenol causes autism.
Oh my gosh.
And there's been a recent study showing that no, Tylenol doesn't cause autism. And it's well known that Tylenol has problems. If you take an overdose of Tylenol, it can wreck your liver. But that's so they're picking on these things. And then here's another thing. This is back to the lottery thing. Back to my one. What I guess it's something that keeps popping up everywhere, which is how randomness, given enough opportunity, weird things happen just due to chance. And so if you give a vaccine to 100 million people, weird things will happen. So it's like bad luck instead of good luck, but it's the same principle. Weird
Yeah,
things will happen just due to chance. Someone will be allergic. Someone will get sick. Someone will get an infection from the needle, having nothing to do with the vaccine. But the point is, in public health, you look at the amount of good something does, and then you look at the weird cases, and then you make a decision. So, for instance, there's um, a popular antibiotic that is called sulfa. There's sulfa drugs. There's a whole class of
right.
antibiotics called sulfa drugs. Well, it turns out, and they're very popular because they work. They don't. There's very
Yeah,
little resistance among bacteria to them, so they're a very popular type of antibiotic. They've been around for years and years. Well, some people are allergic to sulfa drugs,
right.
myself included.
Oh,
So, so I can't take sulfa drugs, but that doesn't mean I want them pulled off the market because they
right.
help lots of people. And the people that they don't help, like me, I can have to make do with another antibiotic.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And it is very, very important to point that out because, as we all know, there was a tremendous amount of, I don't know what you'd call it, outcry perhaps, when the COVID vaccines came out because of all these people allegedly having bad reactions. But as you're pointing out here, when before has a vaccine been given to such a massive population size, right? All at the same time. And as you're saying, statistically, somebody is going to have some bad outcomes from that. But percent of total recipients of the vaccine, it's very, very small, if I'm understanding you correctly.
That's right. And so, I mean, well, that's, I mean, if it isn't very, very small, then you don't want that vaccine. But
Right.
in the
Yeah.
case, as you say, in the case of the COVID vaccine, which is a kind of a miracle, in just a few months, a vaccine was put on the market, and um, this was in President Trump's term, and right now he's getting heavily criticized for having RFK Jr. be the head of Health and Human Services because he's the autism and vaccines guy.
Right.
But it was his administration that got this COVID vaccine pushed through in record time. And you're absolutely right. It was an amazing accomplishment and had just comparatively to other medications, was well in the range of safe drugs and worked. It
Yes.
was very effective. So,
Yeah.
but my point is statistically is that given that you're going to give a vaccine to 100 million people, there'll be some people who have problems, and it's a public health decision, but it's not just because a few people have problems. Even like on all drugs, like antibiotics, I mentioned the sulfa example, you have to decide what's better for public health.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that your book is a must read. And anybody who's listening to this, I would encourage you to buy the book and read it. I'm going to put the links to where you can get the book on Amazon, of course, but elsewhere as well. It'll be in the show notes if you're listening to this as a podcast over a podcast network, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the description area. I think that as Dr. Orkin is pointing out here, you need to understand statistics today in order to make any sense of the world.
That's right. I'm afraid that's true. And it is
Yeah.
also true that undergraduate statistics is now the most popular course offered in colleges. And by most popular, I mean more departments require it than any other course.
Is that true? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, there are other things, you have to have the basic math, basic English and
Mm.
stuff. Everyone has to have those. But as far as college courses, basic statistics is required by sociology, by political science, by psychology, by math, by
Mm.
biology. And so it's an important course.
Wow.
But now data science, now it's some versions of it are called data science,
Right.
in which large data is analyzed, and that's a topic for another conversation. I do a lot of consulting in data analysis. But,
Well, I will love to have you back on for another episode to talk about that.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Dr. Orkin, for being with us here on A Seat at the Table. I have learned a tremendous amount. I'm definitely going to get the book, and I may be signing up for a course in intro statistics.
Thanks, Jen.
I certainly
you can
could
take
use
my
it.
course online. You can
Okay.
take my course online.
Well, if you have a link for
Berkeley
that,
City
then
College.
we'll include that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Berkeley City College every semester. Yeah, I guess I do have a link. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again. Really, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for being with us here today on A Seat at the Table. If you'd like to see some of the other episodes, head on over to our podcast website at seat.fm. That's SEAT.fm. There's also a link here in the show notes. And if you're thinking that you'd like to be a guest on the show, you'll find information on how to apply there as well. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Jane Singer, and I will see you in the next episode.